Welcome to another thrilling historical Western romance audiobook, The Bride of the Plains. If you are new to our channel, we invite you to subscribe and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our daily releases of captivating historical Western romance stories. And if you enjoy our content, don't forget to leave a like to show your support. For our loyal listeners, welcome back. Excited to have you here again. Shall we begin? Chapter 1. Westward Dreams. The train hissed and groaned as it lurched to a halt, sending a plume of steam swirling into the vast, cloudless sky. Clara Whitfield pressed a gloved hand to her chest, her heart pounding as she stood at the edge of the platform. Her journey from Boston had been long and arduous. Days of rattling cars, soot-streaked windows, and crude remarks from men emboldened by liquor and the wilderness. But none of it dampened her anticipation. In her other hand she clutched the letter. Henry McAllister's neat handwriting was smudged from the countless times she'd unfolded it, reading and rereading his words of promise. "A home of your own," he had written. "A fresh start. I am a man of means, Clara, and I can offer you safety and kindness." She had pinned her future on those words, on the dream of belonging somewhere, anywhere but back east, where scandal had closed every door. The Willow Creek train station, if it could be called that, was little more than a weathered wooden platform beside a single track, with a crooked sign overhead that creaked in the prairie breeze. Dust stirred in lazy swirls across the ground, clinging to her skirts and settling in her throat. She lifted her gaze to the town beyond, a scattering of wooden buildings along a dirt road. A saloon with faded paint and swinging doors stood at the centre, flanked by a general store with a cracked window and a small church whose steeple leaned precariously to one side. Not the bustling town she had imagined, but it was hers now. People gathered at the platform, their faces lined with curiosity, or was it suspicion? Women in calico dresses whispered behind gloved hands, their gazes darting to her bonnet and back. Men lounged near the freight crates, eyes lingering too long, their gazes bold in a way that made her stomach knot. Clara lifted her chin, smoothing her travelling dress, though the hem was already rimmed with dust. She was no stranger to gossip, but the weight of so many strangers' stares was heavier than she had expected. Her gaze swept the platform. "Where is he?" Henry should have been here, his hat in hand, his smile reassuring. She had pictured it countless times, him stepping forward, offering his arm with gentlemanly charm. But there was no man approaching, no one calling her name, just the shrill caw of a crow overhead and the murmured voices of onlookers. "Miss Whitfield!" The voice was rough, edged with authority, but softened by a hint of concern. She turned to find a man in his middle years approaching. He wore a brown vest over a faded shirt, his badge catching a glint of sunlight. His hat was pulled low, but she could see lines carved deep into his face, weathered skin that spoke of long days in the sun and nights of little rest. "Yes," she stammered, clutching her satchel tighter. Relief flooded her, though it was tempered by caution. "I'm Clara Whitfield, Sheriff Tom Gaines." He tipped his hat, eyes kind but wary. "Heard you were coming. Henry McAllister mentioned you in town a few months back." "Months?" Clara's relief began to unravel. "He should be here. Is Henry nearby? Perhaps he's—" The sheriff's expression shifted. Less welcome, more regret. He glanced at the townsfolk, whose whispers seemed to grow louder. "Can we talk away from folks?" Clara's heart dropped. Nothing good ever followed words spoken in that tone. Nodding, she let him lead her down the platform, her boots crunching over the dusty planks. I don't know how to say this delicate-like," Sheriff Gaines began, rubbing the back of his neck. "Henry's gone, missin', Miss Whitfield." She stopped short, the words slamming into her like a gust of cold wind. "Missin'? But he wrote me. He asked me to come. I thought we were to be married." Her voice faltered, thick with disbelief. "I don't doubt he did," the sheriff said gently. "But truth is, ain't no one seen hide nor hair of him in weeks. Up and vanished after racking up debts at the saloon. Rumour has it he owed money to some folk you don't want to cross." Clara felt her knees weaken, her dream crumbling at the edges. How could this be happening? Her entire life back in Boston, left behind for a man who wasn't even here, who might never have intended to be. I don't understand, she whispered, tears pricking her eyes. Why would he? What am I supposed to do? The sheriff sighed, sympathy etched across his face. Wish I had answers. Look, I've got a spare cot at the jailhouse if you ain't got nowhere else. Townsfolks can be rough on newcomers, especially ones tied to Henry. Tied to Henry! The words coiled around her like a rope she hadn't realized was tightening. She swallowed hard, pushing back tears. No, she wouldn't break down. Not here. Not in front of all these strangers. Thank you, Sheriff, she managed, voice steadier than she felt. I just need a moment. He nodded, tipping his hat once more before turning back toward the gathering crowd, his shoulders heavy with responsibility. Clara remained standing at the edge of the platform, the vast prairie stretching out before her, endless, empty. The wind tugged at her bonnet ribbons, and she squeezed the letter in her hand, the paper crinkling beneath her fingers. Henry's words felt like ash now, slipping through her grasp. She had come west for a fresh start, for a home and a husband. Now all she had was dust in her boots, whispers at her back, and a future as uncertain as the plains stretching out to meet the horizon. But as she drew in a shaky breath and lifted her chin against the relentless wind, a spark of resolve flickered to life. Life had knocked her down before. She hadn't given up then, and she wouldn't now. Not even the wilds of the West could scare off Clara Whitfield. The heat of the midday sun seemed to press down upon Clara, its rays burning against her skin as she walked down the dirt-packed road toward the saloon. Her boots kicked up small clouds of dust, each step echoing with the hollow sound of her uncertainty. She had been promised a new life, a future with Henry McAllister, but now all she had was a letter, a name, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. She had tried to make sense of the sheriff's words, but it was like trying to catch the wind in her hands. Henry's disappearance was a cruel twist, a betrayal from a man who had, in the pages of his letters, painted himself as a man of honor. But here, in this foreign land, Clara realized that honor had no place in a town like Willow Creek. As she approached the saloon, the sound of raucous laughter and the clinking of glasses drifted out from behind the swinging doors. The building itself seemed to sag under the weight of its own history, the old wood creaking like a ship on the verge of sinking. The faded sign above the door, the silver spur, swung lazily in the wind, its paint chipped and peeling like the promises Henry had made to her. Clara hesitated before stepping inside, her heart racing with a mixture of hope and trepidation. She hadn't come here to find solace. No, she had come for answers. The men in town had to know something, anything about where Henry had gone. The door creaked open, and Clara was immediately hit with the heavy scent of whiskey, smoke, and the earthy odor of sweat. The saloon's interior was dimly lit, the flickering gas lamps casting shadows on the rough-hewn wooden walls. At the far end of the room a piano played a slow, tuneless melody, but it did nothing to ease the tension that gripped Clara's chest. The low murmur of voices stopped momentarily as she entered, and she could feel every pair of eyes in the room turn toward her. Some were curious, some dismissive, and others were hungry. Clara's skin prickled as she scanned the room. A man with a rough face and a wide-brimmed hat took her in with an unsettling. His eyes lingered on her dress, then slowly travelled upward, a wicked smile tugging at his lips. She swallowed hard, fighting the urge to turn on her heel and flee. But she couldn't. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to let fear stop her now. She needed to find out what had happened to Henry. She needed answers. "Looking for someone, miss?" The voice came from behind her, a deep drawl that sent a shiver down her spine. She turned to find a man leaning against the bar, his hat pulled low to shadow his eyes. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a grin that made her stomach twist. She took a steadying breath, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. "I'm looking for Henry McAllister," she said, her voice coming out a little too breathless. At the mention of Henry's name, the man's smile faltered, just for a moment before it returned, colder. "McAllister? Ha! Haven't seen him round here in a while, miss. He's probably off somewhere." His voice trailed off, and Clara could feel the shift in the room, the men's gazes becoming more calculating, more predatory. Clara took a step back, suddenly very aware of how vulnerable she was. The door to the saloon felt like it was miles away, and the oppressive heat of the room was suffocating. She didn't belong here. She never had. Her mind raced as she tried to gather her thoughts, but it was hard to focus with every eye in the room on her. The men were whispering now, their voices low and mocking, though she couldn't make out the words. She could feel the weight of their judgment, their amusement at her discomfort, and it made her feel small. "Miss," came a sharp voice from the door, cutting through the tension like a knife. Clara turned toward the sound, relief flooding her when she saw a woman standing in the doorway, her broad frame filling the entrance. The woman's auburn hair was tied back in a neat bun, and she wore a simple yet well-kept dress. Her eyes were warm but steely, as though she had seen enough of the world's harshness to know when a person needed help. "Mary Lou Dawson," the woman said, her voice firm and commanding. She wasn't offering a handshake, but her gaze was more comforting than anything Clara had encountered since stepping foot in Willow Creek. "You're the one who came on the train, right?" Clara nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Yes, I'm Clara Whitfield." "Well, Miss Whitfield," Mary Lou said, her gaze scanning the room, "I can see you've made a bad choice by stepping into this place." Her words weren't judgmental, just factual. "These men don't know a thing about respect." Clara's cheeks burned with embarrassment, but she didn't argue. She had felt the coldness in the air the moment she had entered. She had been foolish to think she would find solace here. "Come on," Mary Lou said, her tone softening as she stepped closer. "You look like you could use a little kindness. I run the boarding house up the street. It's not much, but it's safe. You can stay there until you get your bearings. These men, they're all talk and no manners. Come with me." Clara hesitated for a moment, torn between her pride and the growing realization that she was truly alone in this strange land. But the kindness in Mary Lou's eyes was too much to ignore. "Thank you," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. Mary Lou's hand landed gently on her shoulder. "Don't thank me yet, child. Just get on out of here with me. I've seen too many women stranded by hope and abandoned by men with pretty words. You deserve more than this." Clara nodded, a mixture of gratitude and shame flooding her chest. She had believed so fervently in the dream of a fresh start, but the reality of Willow Creek, with its harsh whispers and cold stares, was far more unforgiving than she had imagined. As Mary Lou guided her out of the saloon and into the unforgiving sunlight, Clara's hope began to crumble. She hadn't expected much, but this was something altogether different, something she wasn't prepared for. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was still hope to be found. In a place like Willow Creek, she would need to find it from within herself. The bell above the door of the general store jingled as Clara stepped inside, her boots clicking against the worn wooden floor. It was cooler in here, a welcome reprieve from the relentless heat of the afternoon. The air smelled of pine, leather, and the sharp tang of tobacco smoke that had woven itself into the walls over the years. Shelves lined with sacks of flour, jars of preserves, bolts of fabric, and tools from a bygone age filled the small, dimly lit space. She hesitated, her gloved hand resting against the doorframe as her eyes adjusted to the shadows. There was something about the place that felt lived in, not like a town store, but more like a place that had withstood the passage of time, like it had witnessed both triumphs and failures. She had only a moment to gather her bearings before Mary Lou, her steadfast protector, appeared by her side. "Come on in, Clara. It ain't much, but it's all we've got," Mary Lou said with a half-smile, leading Clara to the counter where a man stood, leaning over it as he negotiated with the storekeeper. The man was tall, his broad shoulders filling the space with ease, and he wore a dark, worn hat that shadowed his face. His hands were rough, calloused from hard work, and his shirt, faded blue clung to his frame as though it had once been pressed but had since settled into the soft, well-worn fabric of a man who lived in the wilderness. Clara's pulse quickened, the air between them seeming to crackle with an unspoken challenge. She knew it the moment he straightened and turned to face her. His eyes, a piercing shade of green, were sharp and assessing, as if he'd sized her up before she even opened her mouth. "This here is Luke Callahan," Mary Lou said, her voice smooth but with a knowing edge. "Luke, this is Clara Whitfield. She just arrived in town." Luke gave a brief nod, his gaze flicking from Mary Lou to Clara, lingering a little too long on her bonnet and dress, as though the fine fabric and lace made him wonder whether she belonged in Willow Creek at all. He didn't smile. Not at first. "Miss Whitfield," he said, his voice deep and gravelly, as though it hadn't been used much of late. "You're looking to work round here, I take it." Clara's chin lifted, and she met his gaze squarely. She wouldn't allow herself to be intimidated by this man, no matter how formidable his presence. "I need work," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "I do whatever's required." Luke raised an eyebrow, clearly sceptical. "You sure about that? This ain't the sort of place where folks wear fancy dresses and lace. It's hard work, Miss Whitfield." His gaze shifted, noting the softness of her hands, the delicate curve of her wrist. "I'm capable," Clara said, her voice firm. "I've done hard work before." He studied her for a long moment, clearly unconvinced. His mouth twisted into something like a smirk, as if amused by the idea of a woman in fine clothes handling the rigours of ranch life. "Hard work, huh?" he muttered under his breath, barely loud enough for her to hear. Then he looked over at Mary Lou. "You think she'd last a day on the ranch?" Mary Lou's eyes softened with a knowing look as she glanced at Clara. "I think she's stronger than she looks, Luke. Just give her a chance. It's not like you've got anyone else willing to work." Luke stared at her for another moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, with a deep sigh, he nodded curtly. "All right. If you're willing to try, Miss Whitfield, you're welcome to come with me. But I'll warn you, it's not going to be easy. You might not last a week." Clara straightened, forcing herself to ignore the sharp edge of his words. "I'll last longer than that," she replied, her chin raised. Luke gave a low chuckle, though it was far from kind. "We'll see about that." The wagon creaked as Luke guided the horses down the dirt road, the rhythm of the wheels matching Clara's uneasy heartbeat. She sat on the hard, splintered seat beside him, trying to ignore the discomfort as the wind tugged at the edges of her bonnet, ruffling her auburn hair. The plains stretched out endlessly before her, an ocean of golden grass and blue sky, and yet there was something oppressive about the vast, empty land. It was beautiful, yes, but lonely. Luke hadn't said a word since they'd left the store. His focus was entirely on the horses, his hands firm on the reins, his gaze fixed ahead. The silence between them felt thick and heavy, like a weight pressing down on her chest. "I didn't expect this," she finally said, her voice breaking through the silence. Luke's eyes flicked to her for the briefest moment. "Expect what, exactly?" She glanced out at the endless expanse of the prairie, the barren horizon where the earth met the sky. "The beauty," she said quietly. It's so different from Boston," he snorted, clearly not impressed. "I'll bet. Can't imagine you'd find much of interest here. Nothing but dirt, dust, and hard work. Not much to keep a city girl like you entertained." Clara bristled at the jab, but kept her tone calm. "I'm not a city girl, Mr. Callahan. I was raised to work, just like anyone else." Luke shot her a look, his lips curling in a half-smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Sure you were," he muttered. "And how do you figure you're going to handle cattle, and branding, and hauling hay?" His voice was a touch more sarcastic now. Clara set her jaw, refusing to back down. "I'll manage." They passed a small copse of trees, the shade a welcome relief, but the moment was fleeting. The land opened up again, vast and uninterrupted, the only sounds the creaking of the wagon and the soft clip-clop of the horses' hooves. It was then that a distant howl carried on the wind, a lonely, eerie sound that seemed to come from the very edges of the land itself. Luke's eyes narrowed as he turned his head toward the horizon, his body tensing ever so slightly. "Wolves," he muttered, his voice low as though he was speaking more to himself than to her. "Stay sharp. They don't usually come this close to the ranch, but you never know when they wander down from the hills." Clara's stomach twisted. She had read about wolves, of course, in books, but hearing that sound, feeling the weight of it in her chest, was something altogether different. Her eyes scanned the plains, but she saw nothing but the undulating grass. "I'll be fine," she said, though her voice was a little more uncertain than she liked. Luke didn't respond. He simply kept his focus on the road, his jaw clenched, his expression unreadable. The distant howl came again, sharper this time, a reminder that out here, in this lonely, untamed land, anything could happen. Clara leaned back against the hard wooden seat, the wind pulling at her skirts, her thoughts swirling like the dust around them. She wasn't sure what she had expected when she came west, but this was something else entirely. The land, the silence, the danger. It was all too much, and yet, somewhere deep inside her, a part of her knew this was exactly where she was meant to be. Even if Luke Callahan was as cold as the wind itself, the early morning light filtered through the thin veil of clouds, casting a soft golden glow over the Callahan ranch. Clara stood at the edge of the barn, staring at the rough-hewn structure and the animals milling about in the yard. The horses snorted and stamped their hooves restlessly, the cows ambled lazily toward the trough, and the chickens scattered at the sight of a shadow moving too close. Her stomach fluttered with a mixture of apprehension and determination. Today was her first full day of work, and she had no illusions about how difficult it would be, but she'd come to Willow Creek with the promise of a fresh start. She wasn't about to let the harshness of ranch life defeat her so easily. Luke had barely said a word to her since they'd arrived at the ranch the evening before. He'd shown her to a modest room in the back of the house, where a narrow bed and simple furnishings awaited. But it wasn't the bed she had trouble with, it was the quiet, the silence between them. It seemed to press down on her, heavier than the weight of any hard labor. Clara pulled the sleeves of her dress down and straightened her shoulders. No time for nerves now. If she was going to make this work, she had to dive in. She made her way to the chicken coop, where the clucking of the hens filled the cool morning air. She knelt beside the wooden structure, the dry, gritty dirt scraping against her knees as she lifted the small door. The chickens, startled by her approach, fluttered wildly, their feathers a blur of motion. She hesitated for a moment, then reached for the first egg she could find. The cold porcelain of the shell sent a shiver up her spine, but she quickly collected it, placing it gently into the basket she'd set beside her. It wasn't exactly glamorous work, but it was necessary. "Need a hand with that, Miss Whitfield?" Luke's voice cut through the quiet, and Clara turned to see him leaning against the barn door, his arms folded across his chest. His eyes were dark and unreadable, and the mocking edge to his tone was impossible to ignore. "I've got it," Clara replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite the discomfort in her chest. She had made up her mind to do this on her own, no more relying on anyone. Luke's lips curled into a smirk. "You sure about that? Looks to me like you're making more of a mess than anything else." Clara's cheeks burned, but she refused to let his words get to her. Instead, she bent down again, focusing on the task at hand. One egg after another, she carefully retrieved them from beneath the hens. The work was simple, but it was foreign to her, nothing like the delicate, orderly tasks she had known back in Boston. As she rose to stand, her back aching from the uncomfortable position, she caught Luke watching her with an amused expression, his eyes glinting in the early morning light. He didn't move, didn't offer any help. He simply stood there watching her struggle. "Feeling ready to tackle the next job, Miss Whitfield?" he asked, his voice low, teasing. Clara's jaw tightened. "I'm not afraid of hard work." She turned on her heel and made her way to the barn, where the sound of hooves and low moos greeted her. The cow barn. This was the part of ranch life she had dreaded the most. Luke had shown her the ropes the night before, but the thought of milking a cow still made her stomach twist. She had seen it done in passing, of course, maids on her father's estate, or the occasional farm hand, but it had always seemed like such an impossible task. Now, standing in front of the large docile cow, Clara felt completely unprepared. The cow stared at her, its brown eyes wide and unblinking, its large frame looming in front of her. "Go ahead, Miss Whitfield. I'm sure you've got it all figured out by now." Luke's voice drifted into the barn, laced with mockery. Clara bit her lip, willing herself to ignore his derision. She crouched down beside the cow, taking hold of the udder, her hands trembling. The warmth of the milk was comforting, but the task itself felt impossible. She pulled gently, but the milk barely trickled into the bucket. Luke's laugh was barely suppressed, and Clara's heart sank. She felt foolish, clumsy. This wasn't what she had envisioned when she dreamed of ranch life. It was nothing like the elegant picture she had painted in her mind. "Maybe you should stick to the chickens," Luke suggested, stepping into the barn and leaning casually against the wall. "I don't think you've got the touch for this." Clara's hands trembled as she tried again, the pain in her fingers from the rough, unaccustomed motion beginning to grow. The skin on her hands was soft, untested by years of hard work, and the friction of the cow's skin was starting to rub them raw. She could feel the blisters forming, but she refused to stop. "I'll do it," she muttered through gritted teeth. Luke watched her for a long moment, his eyes studying her every move. His smirk faded into something more contemplative, though he said nothing. Clara's breath was coming in short gasps now. The pain in her hands was unbearable, and her back ached with the effort of bending low. But she didn't stop. She refused to stop. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she heard the sound of milk splashing into the bucket, steady and rhythmic. She could feel the warmth of victory. A small, quiet triumph, but a triumph nonetheless. "Good job, Miss Wickfield," Luke said quietly, his voice holding something that could almost be respect. Clara looked up, her face flushed with exhaustion and pride. She didn't speak, but her eyes met his, and for the first time she saw something softer in his gaze, something that suggested he might not think of her as entirely useless. She wiped her hands on her apron, feeling the tender skin of her palms. But she didn't care. She had proved something to herself today. She had survived her first day on the ranch, and it was only the beginning. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the Callahan ranch as Luke made his way to the barn. The air had cooled slightly, but the weight of the day still clung to him like the dust on his boots. His muscles ached from the labor of the past few days, but it was a deep, satisfying ache, one that came from doing the kind of work that made a man feel solid, grounded. Yet there was something about the ranch today that felt different, a restless edge in the wind, a whisper of trouble hanging over everything. As he approached the barn, his eyes caught the flash of white paper pinned to the wooden door. He stopped short, his jaw tightening as he recognized the shape of the note before even getting close. The paper was roughly tacked to the weathered wood with a rusty nail, its message glaring up at him in black ink. "McAllister's debt is yours now." Luke's heart skipped a beat, his gut churning with the all-too-familiar weight of danger. He knew exactly who had left that note. Jed Ramsey. That low life had never been anything more than trouble, and now it seemed that trouble had found its way to him. The sound of Clara's footsteps behind him broke his thoughts. She had finished the evening chores and was making her way toward the barn, her silhouette framed by the dimming light of the horizon. Her presence stirred something in Luke, a rare twinge of concern. He didn't want her to see the note, didn't want her to know just how deep into the muck he'd gotten. He strode forward, ripping the note from the barn door without a second glance. He could feel Clara's gaze on him, but he didn't turn to meet it. His mind was already working, calculating the risks, weighing the options. "Everything all right?" Clara's voice was soft, cautious, as if she sensed something was off. Luke didn't answer her immediately. He crumpled the note in his fist and shoved it into his pocket. He couldn't afford to alarm her. Not now. He had to keep this to himself for as long as possible. "Just some business I need to take care of," he muttered, brushing past her to head inside the barn. His boots kicked up the gravel underfoot, but his stride remained steady, deliberate. Clara stood there for a moment, her brow furrowing as she watched him disappear into the barn. She didn't ask again. Instead, she let out a quiet breath, her own thoughts drifting to the past few days, to the way things had been slowly changing between them. Luke's coldness, his distance. It had made her wary, but there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when he seemed almost human, when he looked at her with something that could almost pass for kindness. She had to remind herself to be patient, but that note, the way he had reacted, it unsettled her. Inside the barn, Luke quickly found a match and set fire to the note, watching it burn to ash in his palm. He stood there for a moment, his back against the door, watching the flames flicker and die, just like the hopes he'd once had for a peaceful life. He didn't want Clara to see him like this, burdened by the past. She deserved better than a man who had spent his youth fighting a war and his adulthood trying to outrun his mistakes. As he threw the remnants of the note into the small stove, his eyes fell on the old photograph resting against the barn wall. It was worn at the edges, the glass cracked from years of neglect, but it still held the faces of the men who had once been like brothers to him, men who had fought beside him in that God-forsaken war, men who had died while he lived. Luke's breath hitched in his chest. He turned away, running a rough hand through his hair. He couldn't afford to get caught up in the past, not now. But Clara had come into his life like a storm, a fresh start, a new beginning. He had hoped for a brief moment that maybe, just maybe, he could leave all the ghosts behind. A rustling sound outside the barn interrupted his thoughts, and he turned to see Clara standing in the doorway, watching him. Her presence was a quiet comfort, even though he couldn't quite place why it unsettled him so much. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the dimly lit barn, landing on the photograph still resting against the wall. Her gaze softened, and she walked toward it slowly, as though drawn by some invisible force. "Who's this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Luke didn't answer immediately. His throat tightened, his heart racing in a way that was all too familiar. He couldn't let her see the past. He couldn't let her see the man he used to be. "It's just an old photo," he muttered, stepping forward and picking it up, turning it face down. "Nothing important." But Clara was persistent. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the worn edges of the frame. "You don't have to hide it, Luke. I won't judge you." He stiffened at her words, his jaw clenching. He wasn't hiding anything. He didn't have the luxury of indulging in sentimentality, not when Jed Ramsay was breathing down his neck, demanding repayment for a debt he never agreed to. "Trust me, Clara," he said, his voice rough with restraint. "There's nothing here for you to see." She studied him for a moment, her eyes softening with understanding, or perhaps pity. But she didn't press him further. She simply gave a small nod and turned to walk back toward the barn doors. "All right," she said, her voice quieter now. "I won't pry." As she left, Luke stood there for a long moment, staring at the place where the photograph had been. He knew it was only a matter of time before his past caught up with him, and when it did, Clara would be caught in the crossfire. He had hoped he could protect her from the darkness in his life, but the truth was, there was no running from the things he had done, no hiding from the ghosts of war and debt that had followed him across the plains, and there was no way to protect her from the danger that was coming. Chapter 2. Sparks in the dust. The wind had been building for hours, a low moan across the prairie, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. By the time the first heavy raindrops began to patter against the windows of the Callahan ranch house, Clara had already finished her evening chores. The sky outside had darkened rapidly, clouds rolling in from the distant hills like an army of shadows, the air thick with the promise of a storm. She stood at the window now, looking out at the storm as it tore through the prairie, the wind whipping the rain sideways. It was a sight so raw, so powerful, that it made her feel small, insignificant against the vastness of the land. The storm's ferocity was unsettling, and she felt the tension in the air, like the world itself was bracing for something to break. A faint creak from the doorway startled her, and she turned to see Luke standing there, his silhouette dark against the flickering light from the hearth. He looked unbothered by the storm's fury, but there was a look in his eyes that told her he wasn't entirely indifferent to it either. "You'll want to stay inside," he said, his voice low and rough, his tone something between a command and a suggestion. Clara nodded, though she wasn't sure she could tear herself away from the window. It had always been the storm that drew her in, that feeling of nature's unrestrained power, a reminder of her own smallness in the world. Luke stepped closer, pulling a chair up to the fire and sitting down with a weary grunt. He had been working all day, and the lines of fatigue were evident in the slump of his shoulders, the weariness in his eyes. He reached for the bottle of whiskey on the mantel, uncorking it with a practised motion. "I reckon we'll be stuck here for a while," he said, pouring a generous measure into a tin cup. "Storm's not going to let up any time soon. You look like you could use something to warm you up." Clara hesitated for a moment, then walked over to the fire, her boots soft on the floorboards. The warmth from the flames kissed her chilled skin, but the tension in the air had seeped into her bones. She glanced at the cup in his hand, the amber liquid glinting in the firelight. She had never been much of a drinker, but there was something about the way the storm raged outside that made her crave the warmth, the comfort of a drink. "I suppose a small one wouldn't hurt," she said, her voice quiet, betraying a hint of uncertainty. Luke poured another measure and handed her the cup, his fingers brushing hers briefly. The touch was fleeting, but the jolt of heat that rushed up her arm was unmistakable. She didn't pull away immediately, and for a second she felt something shift in the air between them. Their eyes met, and there was a flicker of understanding. He saw it too, the way the touch lingered in the silence, unspoken but heavy. Clara quickly took the cup, lifting it to her lips to hide the warmth spreading across her cheeks. She took a small sip, the burn of the whiskey warming her from the inside. It was strong, a little too much so, but it did the job of easing the tension in her shoulders. They sat in silence for a few moments, the storm outside the only sound. The wind howled, pressing against the walls of the ranch house, and the fire crackled, its orange glow dancing in the quiet. "I lost someone too," Luke said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was softer now, his tone distant, as if the words were hard for him to speak. Clara turned her gaze to him, studying the lines on his face, the way his jaw tightened when he spoke of loss. She didn't push him, but there was something about the way he carried the weight of his silence that made her want to know more. "My brother," Luke continued, his eyes far away, "he died in the war, fought beside me. We were close, you know." He paused, running a hand through his hair, his fingers brushing against the back of his neck, as though he were trying to dislodge the memories. "He was taken in the Battle of Gettysburg. Shot through the chest. There wasn't even time to say goodbye. He never stood a chance." Clara felt her heart tighten for him, the rawness of his grief settling in the space between them. "I'm sorry, Luke," she said quietly, her voice soft with empathy. He glanced at her then, a flicker of surprise in his eyes at the tenderness in her tone. He looked away again almost immediately, though there was a small shift in his posture, a loosening of the tension he carried so heavily. "It's a long time gone now," he muttered, though Clara could see it still haunted him, like a shadow that refused to leave. "But it don't ever really go away, you just learn to live with it." Clara took another sip of whiskey, the warmth of the drink spreading down her throat as she absorbed his words. She knew what it was like to carry a weight you couldn't shake, though her loss wasn't the same as his. "I was disowned," she said softly, almost to herself, but loud enough for Luke to hear. "By my family after—" She faltered for a moment, the old shame rising in her chest, but she pushed it down. "After a scandal. They said I had ruined the Whitfield name, that I was a disgrace. They made sure I knew I wasn't welcome in their lives any more." Luke's gaze softened, his eyes studying her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable, but in a way that felt safe somehow. He didn't ask questions, didn't press her for details. He simply allowed her to speak, to share what she had been holding inside. "People can be cruel," he said finally, his voice rough with something like sympathy, "but they don't get to decide who you are. You decide that." His words settled into her like a balm. For a moment Clara didn't feel like the woman who had been discarded by her own family, the one who had lost everything for a mistake she hadn't even made. She felt seen. She swallowed the lump in her throat, then set her cup down on the table beside her. The warmth of the whiskey had done its job, loosening the tightness in her chest, but now something else had taken its place, something that felt much more dangerous. A brief, charged silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. The fire crackled, the storm raged outside, but in that moment it was as though time itself had stilled. Then, almost imperceptibly, their hands brushed again. This time it was no accident. Her fingers lingered against his for a breath, a heartbeat before she pulled away, her pulse pounding in her ears. The moment passed quickly, but it left a lingering warmth that neither of them acknowledged. "I should get to bed," Clara said, her voice quiet, almost too quiet for the storm outside. She turned to leave, but before she reached the door she paused, her hand resting on the frame. "Thank you, Luke," she said softly, "for listening." He didn't say anything for a long moment, then spoke, his voice low. "No need to thank me. Just don't let anyone tell you who you are, Clara, not even yourself." Clara nodded, her heart beating faster than it should. She stepped out of the room, leaving him behind, but the storm inside her, this strange, confusing pull toward him, was only just beginning. The next morning the air was thick with the dust of the prairie, the wind carrying whispers and murmurs like an unwelcome guest. Clara had never been one to care much for the opinion of others, but as she made her way down the main street of Willow Creek, she couldn't ignore the way the townsfolk watched her, their eyes lingering just a moment too long. She had hoped that things might settle down after the stormy night, that she might find a little peace in the work she was so determined to do. But as she passed the general store and the saloon, she noticed the glances, the barely hidden whispers, and the sideways looks that followed her every move. It didn't take long for Clara to understand what was happening. "Did you hear about that Whitfield girl?" The voice came from the porch of the general store, carried on the wind but loud enough for Clara to hear. She stopped in her tracks, her heart sinking in her chest as the familiar name pierced the air. "She's living at Callahan's place now. Can't believe he'd take her in after what happened with McAllister." Clara's breath hitched as the words stung. She turned slightly, her eyes scanning the group of women who stood nearby, their conversation continuing in hushed tones, but with enough volume to reach her ears. They didn't even bother to lower their voices when they saw her standing there. "Poor thing," one of them murmured. "I hear she's looking for a husband, but with all that scandal—" Clara's hands clenched at her sides, her skin burning with a mixture of shame and anger. She could feel the heat of their judgment, the weight of their whispers pressing down on her shoulders. The whispers were nothing new, but this felt different. This felt personal. She kept walking, forcing her feet to move despite the heaviness in her chest. The heat of the afternoon sun was nothing compared to the blaze of humiliation she felt inside. By the time Clara reached the ranch, she was on the edge of tears. She didn't want to cry, she'd never been one to show weakness. But the gossip, the assumptions, it hurt. Luke was at the barn when she arrived, the sound of hooves and the creaking of the barn door filling the air. He was busy working with the horses, his hands rough and sure as he tethered them to the post. Clara stood there for a moment, watching him, before she squared her shoulders and walked toward him. She wasn't sure how to approach him, but she had to confront him about what she had overheard. "Luke," she said, her voice steady but laced with the hurt she couldn't hide. He didn't look up at first, his hands busy with the ropes. "What is it, Clara?" he asked, his tone neutral, as if she were just another chore to be done. "I heard what they're saying about me," she said, her words cutting through the air. She took a step closer, her eyes never leaving his. "The rumours, the gossip. About me staying here with you." He finally looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if he had expected this conversation to come sooner or later. "They're going to talk, Clara," he said, his voice colder than the winter wind. "No matter what you do, people will talk. You can't change that." Clara felt her chest tighten, her breath catching in her throat. She had expected indifference from Luke. He was, after all, a man who had no use for sentimentality, but his coldness stung in a way she hadn't anticipated. "You don't care, do you?" she asked, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "You don't care what they say about me. Or about us." Luke's jaw clenched, and for a moment she thought he might say something to deny it, to offer some kind of explanation. But he didn't. Instead he shrugged, the gesture almost careless. "I'm not here to cater to what people think," he said, his voice hard. "And neither should you. People talk. It's what they do. You never stop them, no matter how hard you try." Clara stood there, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. His words echoed in her ears, cutting through the thin veneer of control she had been trying so hard to maintain. It wasn't that she cared what others thought. No, it was that this was different. She had worked so hard to escape her past, to prove herself to the world, and now she was once again the subject of gossip, the object of judgment. "You're right," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "People will talk, but I won't let them decide who I am. Not again." Luke didn't respond. He simply turned back to his work, his hands moving with practiced ease as he checked the horse's reins. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of frustration and resolve flooding her veins. He didn't understand. Not the way she did. He didn't know what it was like to be cast aside, to have your name dragged through the mud, but she would prove them all wrong. She would prove to Luke and to the town that she was not the woman they thought she was. She was strong, she was capable, and she wasn't going to let the whispers of a few narrow-minded people define her future. "I'll show you," she said, her voice trembling only slightly. "I'll show everyone that I belong here." Luke didn't look at her, didn't respond, but Clara didn't need him to. She didn't need his approval. She didn't need anyone's approval. She turned and walked back to the house, the weight of the town's gossip still pressing on her shoulders, but now with a sense of determination. She would work harder. She would prove herself not just to Luke, but to everyone who thought she didn't belong, no matter what it took. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the town of Willow Creek. The streets, usually so quiet and dusty, felt suddenly alive with a palpable tension. Clara stood on the porch of the ranch house, her hands resting lightly on the railing as she watched the scene unfolding down the road. She had learned quickly that this town, while small and remote, held its own set of rules. Gossip ran like a current through the streets, and the unspoken fears of the townsfolk swirled like dust in the wind. Today, however, the unease wasn't just a product of rumour, it had flesh and bone. And it was coming in the form of a group of riders headed toward town. The horses' hooves kicked up the dry earth, their rhythm steady and menacing as they rode in. At the head of the pack was Jed Ramsay, his figure unmistakable. Even from this distance, Clara could feel the weight of his presence, the way he commanded attention, the way his very being seemed to darken the air around him. Jed was a man of power, a man who had made his fortune on the fringes of the law, his hands stained with the kind of blood that never washed clean. Clara had heard whispers about him from the townsfolk, stories of his ruthless dealings, of the way he got what he wanted and left destruction in his wake. She stepped back from the porch, her heart hammering in her chest. She knew trouble was never far behind when Jed Ramsay was involved, and with him came his band of loyal men, rough and dangerous, their eyes hungry for anything they could take. As the gang rode through the town's main street, the few townsfolk still out and about hurried to find cover, their gazes lowering to the ground in submission. Jed's men dismounted at the edge of the saloon, their boots hitting the dusty ground with a thud that seemed to echo through the silence. Clara's instinct screamed at her to retreat, but she couldn't. She stood, frozen, her pulse quickening, as Jed approached the Callahan. He rode with a casual air, as if this was a routine visit, rather than the arrival of a man who could tear a life apart with a single command. "Clara Whitfield," he called, his voice rough but laced with an insidious smile. "Been hearing all sorts of things about you. Thought I might pay a visit." Her heart skipped in her chest, and she took an instinctive step back. There was a coldness to his gaze that made her skin crawl. His eyes, dark and calculating, never left hers as he rode closer, his men flanking him like wolves closing in on prey. "Mr. Ramsay," Clara said, forcing the words out, though they felt heavy on her tongue. She straightened, attempting to appear calm despite the fear that prickled her spine. "You've been keeping company with Luke Callahan, I hear," Jed continued, his voice smooth, but his words sharp as a knife. "Seems like he's been kind enough to take you in. What a charitable man he is." He leaned forward in the saddle, his face close enough now that Clara could smell the stale whiskey on his breath. Clara's stomach turned. She knew exactly where this conversation was heading, but she wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. "What do you want, Mr. Ramsay?" she asked, her voice steady despite the anxiety tightening in her chest. Jed smiled, a wicked, knowing grin. "What I want is what I'm owed. Your little friend, McAllister, he left behind a lot of unfinished business, and now that business falls to Callahan." Clara's stomach dropped. "What business?" Jed's smile widened, and he leaned forward even more. "Debt," he said with a low chuckle, "and I don't take kindly to debts left unpaid. McAllister owed me a substantial sum, and I expect Luke to pay it, or there will be consequences." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She hadn't known the full extent of Henry's dealings, but now the truth was becoming painfully clear. Henry's debts weren't just a matter of money. They were a matter of life and death. Before she could respond, the sound of heavy boots interrupted the conversation. Luke appeared at the edge of the yard, his expression hard, his posture tense. His eyes flicked from Clara to Jed, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. "I suggest you leave, Jed," Luke said, his voice icy. "This doesn't concern you any more." Jed's grin never wavered, but there was something colder, more dangerous about it now. "Oh, but it does concern me, Callahan," he said, dismounting from his horse with a fluid motion. "You see, when McAllister ran out on me, I made sure he understood the cost of doing business with someone like me. And now, his debts belong to you." Luke's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. He took a step forward, his body coiled with barely contained anger. "I'm not paying your debts, Jed. I'm not your man to use." Jed's men, sensing the rising tension, took a step toward Luke, their hands resting on their weapons. Clara's breath caught in her throat. "I don't care what you think, Callahan." Jed snarled, stepping closer. "You'll pay one way or another." Before Clara could even take a breath, Luke was on him, his fists flying. The first punch landed square on Jed's jaw, sending him stumbling back. The men with Jed surged forward, and within moments a chaotic brawl erupted, fists and feet flying, dust swirling in the air like a storm of its own. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped back, her hands instinctively reaching for something to hold on to. The violence before her was brutal, raw, and yet it was nothing compared to the fear twisting in her stomach. She couldn't let them tear each other apart. She couldn't let Luke get hurt. "Enough!" she shouted, her voice hoarse with desperation. She stepped forward, trying to pull the men apart, but her voice was drowned out by the sound of grunts and the crack of fists against flesh. Finally, Sheriff Gaines appeared, his voice carrying across the yard. "That's enough, both of you," he barked, stepping into the fray with authority. "This ain't the time or the place for this nonsense." It took several more moments for the fight to wind down, but eventually the men stepped back, each of them breathing heavily, their clothes torn and faces bruised. Luke stood at the center, his fists clenched at his sides, his chest rising and falling with each breath. Jed, though shaken, stood tall, a sneer still twisting his lips. "You'll regret this, Callahan," Jed said through gritted teeth, his voice laced with venom. "This ain't over." Without another word, he signalled to his men, and they mounted their horses, riding off into the distance. The storm had passed, but the damage had already been done. Luke stood still, watching them leave, his face hard as stone. Clara moved to his side, her hand reaching out, but she hesitated, unsure if she should touch him. "I'm fine," he muttered, his voice rough, though it held no anger, just a deep, brooding weariness. "It's just a matter of time before they come back." Clara nodded, her mind racing. She had seen firsthand what Jed Ramsay was capable of, and she knew it wasn't over, not by a long shot. But she also knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let fear keep her from fighting for what she believed in. Not now, not ever. The sun had barely risen when Clara walked into the small, dimly lit study of the ranch house, the weight of the ledger in her hands too heavy for her to ignore. She had found it tucked away in a drawer in the back room, its edges worn, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. It had been nearly 2 weeks since Henry had disappeared, and in that time Clara had tried to keep her mind busy with work, feeding the animals, helping Luke with the tasks he had set for her, and trying to ignore the constant hum of anxiety in the back of her mind. But today, as the light of the morning spilled through the window, she couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. When she opened the ledger, her breath caught. It was filled with names and figures, all written in Henry's meticulous hand, but at the bottom of the last page was a name that made her stomach twist, a name she hadn't expected to see. Luke Callahan. Clara's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the entries. There were notes about debt, amounts owed, and a list of transactions that led back to the Callahan ranch. The figures were staggering. The money Henry owed was more than what she had ever imagined, and the ledger suggested that Luke had been profiting from it, either knowingly or unknowingly. Her mind raced as she tried to piece together the puzzle. Had Luke been involved in Henry's disappearance? Had he been part of the scheme to run off with the money? The thought was unbearable, but the evidence in front of her seemed damning. She didn't want to believe it, she couldn't. But the more she looked at the ledger, the more she felt as though the rug was being pulled out from under her. Clara's heart hammered in her chest as she made her way to the barn where she knew Luke would be working with the horses. She could feel the anger rising in her, hot and sharp, but beneath it was a deeper sense of betrayal, a feeling that she had been blind, that she had trusted too easily. When she reached the barn, Luke was finishing up with the horses, brushing down the large gelding with practised ease. He didn't notice her approach at first, and Clara stood in the doorway for a moment, gathering her thoughts. She didn't know how to confront him, how to put into words the feelings of hurt and confusion swirling inside her, but she knew she had to. "Luke," she said, her voice tight with emotion. He turned at the sound of her voice, his brow furrowing as he saw the ledger in her hand. His expression shifted, his shoulders tensing, and for a moment Clara saw something in his eyes, a flicker of apprehension, quickly masked. "Clara," he said, his voice low and guarded. "What's that?" She held it up, her fingers shaking. "What is this, Luke? Why does Henry's ledger have your name in it?" Luke's face went still, his jaw tightening as he set down the brush he had been holding. He stepped toward her, but Clara took a step back, not wanting him too close. Her heart raced as she tried to hold her ground. "You need to explain this," she said, her voice shaking now, a mixture of confusion and anger in her words. "It looks like you've been profiting from Henry's disappearance. Was this all part of some plan?" Luke's eyes darkened, and Clara could see the storm brewing in them. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. He looked away for a moment, running a hand through his hair before turning back to face her. "Clara, He paused, as if searching for the right words. "It's not what you think. I didn't know anything about McAllister's debts until it was too late, and I'm not going to sit here and explain myself." His voice had hardened, and Clara could see the tension in every line of his body. Clara felt the sting of his words. He was pushing her away, just like everyone else had. She had trusted him, believed in him, but now he was shutting her out. I don't understand, Luke," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought you were different. I thought you were a man of honor, but this doesn't feel like honor. It feels like betrayal." Luke stepped forward again, his expression dark and unreadable. "You don't understand, Clara," he said, his voice low and intense. "You think I'm just some villain in this story, but it's not that simple. I didn't ask for any of this." Clara shook her head, her breath catching in her throat. "You didn't ask for it, but you're involved in it, and now I'm involved too." Luke's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You don't know what it's like to be tied to someone like McAllister. He got in over his head, and now I'm the one left to clean up the mess." His voice was thick with frustration, but Clara wasn't sure if it was frustration with her or with himself. She took another step back, the coldness creeping into her chest. "I don't know what to believe any more, Luke." Luke's gaze softened for just a moment, but then it hardened again. "I never asked you to believe anything. You're here because you chose to be, Clara. And if you don't like the way things are, you're free to leave." The words hit Clara like a slap, and her heart sank. She hadn't expected him to say that, not after everything they had shared. She had come to this ranch to escape her past, to find a new life, but now it felt like she was standing at the edge of something she couldn't understand, something that was slipping through her fingers no matter how hard she tried to hold on. Without saying another word, Clara turned and walked away, her heart breaking with each step. She couldn't stay here, not now, not when the man she had trusted had become a stranger. She made her way to Mary Lou's house, the path to the boarding house familiar and comforting. As she walked, the weight of the ledger and Luke's cold words pressed down on her, and the storm inside her seemed to swell. She was tired of being hurt, tired of trying to make sense of a world that never gave her the answers she needed. When she reached the door of Mary Lou's house, she knocked softly, her hands trembling. The door opened almost immediately, and Mary Lou looked at her with concern. "What's wrong, Clara?" Clara didn't answer right away. She just stepped inside, her heart heavy with the weight of betrayal and confusion. "I need to stay here tonight," she said, her voice raw. "I can't be at the ranch anymore." Mary Lou's gaze softened, and she nodded. "Of course, dear. Come in." Clara stepped inside, feeling the warmth of the house envelop her. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to break, the tears flowing freely as she sank into the safety of Mary Lou's embrace. Chapter 3. Lost and Taken. The morning had begun like any other, a quiet rhythm of chores and tasks around the ranch. Clara, though still carrying the weight of the past few days, had managed to push her hurt to the back of her mind. The day was clear, the sun bright, and the air fresh with the scent of grass and earth. It was the kind of morning that made one feel like they could outrun their troubles, if only for a while. She had ventured into Willow Creek to gather supplies, a simple errand that should have been nothing more than a brief interruption to her day. She had no intention of staying long, just a quick visit to the general store to pick up some fabric for repairs and perhaps a few other things the ranch needed. But as Clara crossed the wide, dusty street toward the store, she felt a shift in the air, a tension almost palpable that made her stop in her tracks. She glanced up and her pulse quickened. There, standing in the shadows of the saloon, was a man she hadn't seen in days but would never forget. Jed Ramsey. His dark eyes gleamed as he watched her, his posture relaxed, but his presence menacing. He wasn't alone. Several of his men were scattered throughout the street, leaning against buildings, lingering in doorways, shadowed figures who seemed to watch her every move. The uneasy feeling that had settled in Clara's gut grew heavier, colder. She didn't know what Jed wanted, but the feeling of being hunted was too real to ignore. Clara's instincts kicked in. She began to walk faster, her footsteps quickening as she made her way toward the store, but before she could reach the door, the sound of heavy boots on the dirt behind her made her freeze. "Thought we might have a word, Miss Whitfield." Jed's voice came from behind her, low and laced with malice. Clara spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, two of Jed's men were on her, their hands rough and strong as they grabbed her arms. "Let me go!" she cried, struggling against their grip. But they were too strong, and her movements were futile. She tried to kick one of them in the shin, but it had no effect. The second man tightened his hold, lifting her off the ground and dragging her toward the alley. "Now, none of that, Miss Whitfield," Jed said, stepping toward her with a wicked grin. "You're coming with us whether you like it or not." "Why are you doing this?" Clara demanded, her voice shaking with fear. "What do you want with me?" Jed's grin widened, and he looked her up and down as if she were no more than a possession to be claimed. "What I want, Miss Whitfield, is for you to help me collect what I'm owed. You're going to help me lure Luke Callahan into a little trap. He's been a thorn in my side for far too long, and I intend to see that he pays for his debts." Clara's blood ran cold. Luke! He was the reason she was here. He was the reason Jed had set his sights on her. She felt her stomach drop as she realized the full extent of the danger she was in. "You're going to use me to get to Luke," Clara whispered, the horror of it sinking in. "Exactly," Jed replied, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "You see, Miss Whitfield, McAllister's little scheme wasn't just a matter of a few stolen coins. The debt goes deeper, and now it's your precious Callahan who's going to pay for it." Clara struggled harder, her heart racing. She knew what this meant. Jed wouldn't stop until Luke was destroyed, and she had no doubt that Jed would kill him if it came to that. "Please, you can't do this," Clara pleaded, panic rising in her chest. "Luke has nothing to do with this. It's Henry you should be after, not him." Jed paused for a moment, his expression hardening. "McAllister's long gone, Miss Whitfield. That's a fact. But he made a mistake when he ran, a big one, and now I'm going to make sure everyone who's tangled up in his little web of lies pays." Clara felt her stomach churn as she realized the true depth of Henry's betrayal. He hadn't just left town, he had run off with stolen money, leaving Jed to clean up his mess. Her mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of information she had. She hadn't known the extent of Henry's dealings with Jed, but now it was becoming clear. Henry had taken what wasn't his to take, and in the process he had dragged Luke into something far darker than either of them had known. She was yanked from her thoughts as the man holding her arm shoved her forward. "Let's move," he growled. The world around her blurred as they dragged her through the dusty streets, past the store and out of the town, toward the woods. Clara struggled with every step, but the men were relentless. She didn't know how far they had taken her before they stopped, but when they finally did, she was surrounded by trees, the air thick with the smell of earth and pine. They pushed her to the ground, her knees scraping against the rough earth as she landed hard. Clara gasped in pain, but she didn't have time to recover before she was hauled to her feet again. Jed stepped closer, his expression triumphant. "It's a simple plan, really. I send you to Callahan, tell him you need help. When he shows up, we take him. And when he's under my control, I'll make sure he pays back every last cent that McAllister owed me." Clara's heart raced in her chest, the reality of the situation sinking in with a horrible finality. She had to stop this. She had to warn Luke. But as she opened her mouth to shout, one of Jed's men slapped a hand over her mouth, silencing her. "You're not going anywhere," Jed said coldly, his eyes narrowing as he watched her. "You're staying right here until Callahan comes, and when he does, we'll have our revenge." Clara's mind whirled as she struggled to free herself from the man's grip. She had to get back to Luke. She had to warn him. But as Jed's words echoed in her ears, a sickening realization hit her. Henry had betrayed them both. He had run off with the money, leaving her caught in the middle of this deadly game. In that moment, Clara understood something she hadn't before. The stakes were higher than she could have ever imagined. This wasn't just about money. This was about survival. And now she had to fight for both her life and Luke's. The sun had begun its descent, casting the vast plains in a warm golden hue. But for Luke, the day felt heavy and dark, like the weight of something ominous pressing down on his chest. He had spent most of the afternoon working the land, his mind preoccupied with the unease that settled into his bones after Jed's arrival in Willow Creek. The tension was still palpable in the air, but the thought of Clara never strayed far from his mind. She had gone into town that morning, a quick errand, or so she had said, but as the hours wore on, the unease gnawed at him. Something felt wrong. The oppressive silence of the ranch was punctuated only by the distant call of the coyotes, the rustle of the wind through the grass, and the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat. It was just past dusk when he spotted it, a small familiar piece of fabric fluttering in the wind along the dirt road leading out of town. His heart skipped a beat as he pulled the reins of his horse to a stop, his eyes locking onto the abandoned shawl lying in the dust. Clara's shawl. The blood drained from his face as he dismounted quickly, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. He knelt beside it, his hands shaking slightly as he picked it up. The fabric was soft, frayed at the edges from use, and the scent of her, fresh and sweet, lingered faintly on the fibres. His chest tightened with a mixture of fear and anger. She hadn't just dropped it, she had been taken. "Clara!" he muttered under his breath, his voice rough with panic. His mind raced, and for a moment he was paralyzed, unsure of what to do, but the fear soon gave way to a cold, furious determination. Luke stood up, his fingers curling tightly around the shawl. His mind flashed back to his time in the war. Those long, desperate days when survival had been a matter of instinct, and every decision had meant life or death. He had learned to think quickly, to act without hesitation. And right now, Clara's life was on the line. Without another word, he turned and mounted his horse, his hand already reaching for the saddlebag where his rifle rested. He wasn't going to wait around for someone to tell him what to do. This was his responsibility. He would get Clara back. As he rode toward town, his thoughts turned to the events of the past few days. The way Jed had looked at Clara, the way he had spoken, there had been something in his tone that hinted at more than just a grudge. Luke knew now with absolute certainty that Jed had taken Clara, and he wasn't going to stop until he had her. The wind whipped through Luke's hair as he rode, his heart pounding in his chest. He passed the familiar landmarks, the general store, the saloon, but they seemed unfamiliar now, like ghosts haunting the edges of his vision. When he reached the edge of town, he spotted Sheriff Gaines, who had been keeping an eye on things, standing by his horse. The sheriff's eyes narrowed as he saw Luke approach, and the concern in his gaze was unmistakable. "Luke, wait up," the sheriff called, his voice gruff as he stepped forward. Luke didn't slow his pace. "Clara's gone. I'm going after her." Sheriff Gaines' face darkened. "I know. I found this." He held out a crumpled note. Jed Ramsey's handwriting, unmistakable, taunting. "She's mine now. You'll pay, one way or another." Luke's blood ran cold as he took the note from the sheriff, his hands trembling with rage. "I knew it," he muttered, his voice low and dangerous. "He's taking her to force my hand. He wants me to come after her." "Luke, listen to me," the sheriff said, his voice sharp with warning. "It's a trap. Jed's not a man you want to face head-on. He's dangerous, and his men are ruthless. You can't go charging in without thinking. He'll kill her if you do." Luke's jaw tightened. "I don't care what happens to me. I'm going after her, Sheriff. If I don't, I might never see her again." Sheriff Gaines looked like he might argue, but he seemed to understand the determination in Luke's eyes. He sighed heavily, the lines of worry deepening on his face. "You're right. I won't stop you, but you need to be smart about this. You can't just ride in there like a madman. Jed's expecting you. He'll have her locked down tight." Luke nodded, his fingers tightening around the reins of his horse. He had fought battles before, and this was no different. He had one goal: get Clara back. "I'll take care of it," Luke said, his voice resolute. "And when I do, Jed won't be able to hurt anyone again." Without waiting for another word, Luke spurred his horse forward, the gallop of hooves pounding against the earth as he made his way out of town, his mind laser-focused on the task ahead. The sheriff's warnings echoed in his ears, but Luke couldn't afford to be anything but determined. His thoughts turned back to Clara, her soft laugh, the way her eyes lit up when she spoke of the future. Those memories fueled the fire that burned in his chest. He had no idea what Jed planned to do with her, but he wouldn't let that man harm her, not as long as he still drew breath. The sky had darkened by the time Luke reached the woods on the outskirts of town. The trees loomed like silent sentinels in the growing dusk, and the air was thick with the scent of pine. He knew this part of the land well. It was rugged, wild, and the perfect place for an ambush. His horse slowed as he approached the clearing, his instincts telling him he was close. The sounds of the forest were eerily quiet, the only noise the rustling of leaves and the distant howl of a coyote. He dismounted, drawing his rifle from the saddle as he surveyed the area. The trap was set, and Luke was going to walk right into it. He clenched his jaw and moved forward, every muscle in his body coiled with anticipation. Clara was out there somewhere, and he would find her, no matter what it took. The night had come quickly, the moon a sliver of silver in the dark sky, as Luke made his way through the narrow trail that wound toward the old mining camp known as Black Mesa. The cold air bit at his skin, but it was nothing compared to the fire burning in his chest. The fire that had driven him for the last several hours, pulling him toward the place where Jed Ramsey had taken Clara. The map was vague, the directions cryptic, but Luke didn't need precision, he needed determination. He knew the land, knew the layout of the abandoned mining sites like the back of his hand, and the men he had been chasing knew it too. He had tracked Jed's gang through the rough terrain for miles, his senses alert and his rifle close. He didn't know what he would find when he got there, but he knew one thing for sure. Clara was counting on him. The wind whispered through the pines as he reached the crest of a hill, his horse's hooves muffled by the dry earth. Below him, nestled in the valley, was the camp. The campfires flickered like beacons, their light casting eerie shadows over the crumbling ruins of the mining equipment. The sound of laughter and coarse voices carried up to him on the breeze, mingling with the crackling of flames. The place was alive with activity, but Luke could feel the tension in the air. He wasn't just going in to rescue Clara, he was walking into a trap. Clara. His heart ached at the thought of her, and every step he took toward the camp seemed to only fuel the fire inside him. She was out there, somewhere in that camp, and he was going to bring her back, no matter the cost. He dismounted quietly, tethering his horse to a tree and drawing his rifle from its holster. The sounds of the camp grew louder, and Luke moved swiftly, staying low, his boots barely making a sound against the ground. He had seen enough fights, enough ambushes to know when something wasn't right. He crouched behind a large boulder, peering down into the camp, his eyes scanning the movement below. Jed and his men were gathered around a fire, drinking and talking. Clara wasn't in sight. Luke's fingers curled around the rifle, his knuckles white. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to act. He stood up, his heart hammering in his chest as he stepped into the clearing, his rifle raised. The wind picked up, the chill of it cutting through the air like a knife. But his focus was unwavering. "Jed!" he called out, his voice ringing clear in the night. Jed's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as he saw Luke standing there, framed by the firelight. "Well, well, Callahan," he sneered, his voice thick with mockery. "I wondered when you'd show up. Where is she?" Luke demanded, his voice low, barely controlled. His rifle was aimed directly at Jed's chest, the tension between them thick as the smoke rising from the campfire. Jed stood slowly, his hand brushing the gun at his side, his men shifting uneasily behind him. "Oh, I think you know exactly where she is. You're standing in the middle of my camp, Callahan. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Luke's jaw tightened, and he took a step forward. "You've got until the count of 3 to release her, Jed. I'm not leaving without her." Jed laughed, the sound hollow and cruel. "And what do you think you're going to do, Callahan? You think you're just going to waltz in here, guns blazing, and walk out with her? I'll do whatever it takes." Luke growled, his voice rough with restrained fury. The air seemed to hang suspended for a moment, the crackling fire the only sound breaking the silence. Luke's eyes never left Jed, his body tense, ready for anything. Then, in an instant, it happened. The sound of gunfire exploded through the air, loud and violent, and Luke dove to the side as bullets tore through the air, the heat of them grazing his arm. He rolled to the ground, his heart racing as he scrambled for cover, his rifle raised. The men with Jed had drawn their guns, the standoff erupting into chaos. Luke's mind raced, calculating, moving with the precision he had learned in the war. His fingers tightened around the rifle's trigger, and in a flurry of motion he fired. The shot hit its mark, sending one of Jed's men sprawling to the ground. But before Luke could react, another shot rang out, and he felt a sharp pain lance through his side. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to remain upright, the pain a dull throb that threatened to pull him under. But he couldn't stop. Not now. He fired again, and another man fell. But his vision was beginning to blur, and his movements were slowing. The blood from his wounds soaked through his shirt, and his breathing grew ragged. Through the chaos, Luke saw her, Clara. She was tied to a post at the far end of the camp, her head down, her body shaking. Her eyes were wide with fear, but there was something in them that told him she hadn't given up. "Clara!" he called, his voice hoarse as he forced himself to his feet, the pain almost unbearable. Her head snapped up at the sound of his voice, and a spark of recognition flashed in her eyes. "Luke!" she cried, her voice trembling. Luke gritted his teeth and charged forward, using the last of his strength to push through the pain. He fought through the haze in his mind, moving toward her, the gunfire ringing in his ears. He reached her, his hands trembling as he cut through the ropes binding her. The moment she was free, Clara threw herself into his arms, her face pressed against his chest as she sobbed. "I thought I'd lost you," she whispered, her voice breaking. Luke's heart ached, and despite the pain ripping through him, he held her tight. "You're safe now," he murmured, his voice rough with relief. "We're getting out of here." But before they could move, Jed's voice cut through the chaos. "Not so fast, Callahan," he sneered, his voice filled with hatred. Luke's eyes flicked to the man, and despite the blood dripping down his side, despite the pain threatening to overwhelm him, he knew what had to be done. He turned to Clara. "Get on the horse," he ordered. "Now!" Clara hesitated, her eyes searching his, but she didn't argue. She ran to the horse that Luke had tethered nearby, and with a final, desperate look at him, she climbed into the saddle. Luke turned to face Jed one last time, his rifle raised, and without hesitation he pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, and Jed fell to the ground, his body crumpling in a heap. Luke didn't wait to see if he was dead. He turned and ran for the horse, climbing into the saddle behind Clara. Without another word, they spurred the horse into action, racing away from the camp, the sound of pursuing footsteps fading into the distance. The pain in Luke's side was unbearable, but it was nothing compared to the relief he felt as they galloped away, the camp receding into the night behind them. Clara was safe, and that was all that mattered. The wind whipped through the trees as Luke and Clara rode hard, their horses' hooves pounding against the earth, the distant sounds of pursuit slowly fading into the night. Luke could feel the blood seeping from the wound in his side, the pressure of it relentless, but his mind was clouded by one thought: getting Clara to safety. She was safe now, out of Jed's hands, but there was still danger in the air, and every second counted. He guided his horse along the narrow trail, barely able to focus on the path in front of him. The world around him seemed distant, muffled by the pain and the exhaustion that was slowly pulling at his limbs. His heart raced, but not from fear. There was something deeper, something that made him push forward despite the cold sweat that dotted his forehead and the dizziness clouding his vision. Clara was behind him, her arms tight around his waist as she clung to him, the warmth of her body against his reminding him why he couldn't give in. They reached an old abandoned shack by the edge of the woods, the silhouette of its dilapidated structure barely visible in the fading light. Luke's horse slowed to a stop, and he dismounted, swaying slightly as his feet hit the ground. Clara slipped off the horse as well, moving to his side immediately, her hands reaching for him. "Luke, you're hurt," she said, her voice soft but urgent. "I'll be fine," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. His body felt heavy, his side aching with every breath. The pain was becoming unbearable, but he forced himself to remain upright. He wouldn't let her see how much it hurt. Clara's hand brushed against his shoulder, steadying him as she guided him toward the shack. "We need to get inside," she said gently, her tone leaving no room for argument. Luke nodded, his steps slow and staggered as he followed her into the dimly lit interior of the shack. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the musty smell of mildew and decay filled the air. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, and that was all that mattered right now. She helped him to a rickety chair by the corner of the room, her hands moving with quick precision as she assessed the injury to his side. He winced as she gently lifted his shirt, her eyes widening at the sight of the blood-streaked fabric. "Luke, this is bad," she whispered, her voice thick with worry. "It's just a scratch," he replied, trying to downplay it, but his voice faltered as he sat back in the chair, the dizziness making it harder to stay focused. Clara didn't respond. She moved to a small, dusty cupboard in the corner of the room and found what she needed: a rough cloth, a basin of water, and some thread. She came back to him, her face set with determination, and began to tend to his wound. Her hands were steady, her movements gentle but firm as she cleaned the wound and began to stitch it up. Luke watched her, his mind foggy as the pain began to ebb, replaced by a strange warmth that came from the tenderness in her touch. He wanted to speak, to thank her, but the words felt stuck in his throat. Clara didn't speak either, but the air between them was thick with unspoken emotion. She worked in silence, her brow furrowed in concentration until she was finished. When she looked up at him, her eyes were softer, the concern in them palpable. "Thank you," he finally murmured, his voice hoarse. She gave him a small, uncertain smile, but there was something deeper in her gaze, a vulnerability he hadn't seen before. "You're welcome," she said quietly, but then her eyes dropped to her hands in her lap. "But you need to stop pushing me away, Luke." His heart gave a jolt at her words, and he looked up at her, surprised by the softness in her tone. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low and careful. Clara met his gaze, her expression a mix of frustration and something deeper. Something raw. "I've seen how you are with people, how you keep everyone at arm's length. You're not the only one carrying something heavy, Luke," she said, her voice thickening. "I know what it's like to feel like you don't deserve to let anyone in. But I've been trying to understand you, trying to see the man beneath all the walls you've built up." Luke's chest tightened at her words, and he shook his head, his gaze dropping to the floor. "You don't know what it's like," he muttered, his voice filled with regret. "I've lost too much, Clara. I can't let myself get close to anyone. Not again." Clara's hands tightened in her lap, and she leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but steady. "You think I don't know what it's like to lose someone?" she asked, her words cutting through the thick silence between them. "I lost my family, my reputation, my future. I thought I was going to die under the weight of it all. And yet, here I am, still standing, still breathing." She paused for a moment, her voice thick with emotion. "I never wanted to fall for you, Luke. You made it clear from the start that you didn't want anyone close. But somehow, despite all of that, I can't deny what I feel for you. I care about you. I care about you more than I should." Luke felt the weight of her words settle over him like a heavy blanket, and his breath caught in his throat. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time in what felt like an eternity. She was right. He had pushed her away. He had built walls so high that he couldn't see over them, couldn't let anyone close enough to see the man beneath. But Clara was different. She had broken through in a way no one else had. And now, as she knelt in front of him, her hands trembling as she adjusted the bandages around his side, he realized how much she had come to mean to him. "Clara," he whispered, his voice thick with the weight of everything he had been holding back, "I never wanted to hurt you. I thought if I kept everyone at a distance I wouldn't lose anyone else." Clara didn't respond immediately. She just reached up, her fingers brushing against his cheek in the softest of gestures, her touch gentle but sure. "You're not alone, Luke," she said quietly. "Not any more." For the first time in a long while, Luke allowed himself to believe it. He leaned into her touch, the raw ache in his heart slowly beginning to ease, replaced by something warmer, something he had buried deep inside for far too long. And in that quiet moment, as the night settled around them, they both understood something. Healing was not just about mending wounds. It was about letting go of the past and allowing each other to move forward, together. The morning sun hung low in the sky, casting a gentle glow over the small town of Willow Creek. The air was crisp with the promise of change, though beneath the calm there was an undercurrent of tension, a sense of unease that had gripped the town for days. It was the kind of silence that held its breath before the storm broke, and today it finally did. Clara stood on the porch of the ranch house, her eyes scanning the horizon. The world around her had felt unsettled ever since she and Luke had returned from their harrowing escape from Jed's camp. The moment they had ridden back into town, Clara had felt the eyes of the townsfolk on her again, their whispers like a cold wind at her back. Luke had kept to himself since their return, retreating into his solitude as usual, but there was a change in him now. Something had shifted between them. Something unspoken, but real. And while the fear of Jed's men still loomed like a shadow, Clara found herself unable to shake the feeling that there was something deeper yet to be uncovered about Henry's involvement in all of this. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of horses' hooves approaching, the rhythm steady and firm. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she saw Sheriff Gaines riding toward the ranch, his face grim and drawn. Behind him, 2 men followed, one leading a pack mule, the other with a somber expression. "Sheriff!" Luke called from where he stood, his voice low but clear. Clara turned to look at him, noticing the way he stood taller, his hands braced on the fence as he awaited the sheriff's approach. There was something in his eyes, an apprehension that matched her own. The sheriff dismounted, his boots crunching against the dry earth as he approached. His hat was pulled low, and his face was set in the kind of grim line that spoke of something more than a routine visit. "Sheriff?" Luke repeated, his voice tighter now. "What's happened?" Sheriff Gaines paused for a moment, his gaze flicking between Clara and Luke before he spoke. "We found Henry's body, Luke." His voice was flat, his words heavy with finality. Clara's heart dropped. She hadn't realized until that very moment just how much hope she'd held on to, the smallest thread of hope that Henry had somehow escaped. But now, as the sheriff's words sank in, that hope shattered like glass. "Drowned while trying to cross the river," the sheriff continued, his voice still thick with regret. "He was weighed down by the money he stole. There's no mistaking it. He was running, and the current took him." Clara's mind raced as she processed the information. Henry had been running, fleeing from the consequences of his own actions, his greed and lies finally catching up with him. But there was something else in the sheriff's words. The faintest trace of sympathy, as though he knew the pain this revelation would cause. Luke stood motionless, his expression unreadable. The news was heavy on him, but there was something else in his eyes. Something that spoke of the weight of responsibility he had carried all these years, the burden of being tied to a man who had done so much wrong. Clara took a step forward, her voice barely a whisper. "So, it was him. It was Henry who left you with all this mess," the sheriff finished for her, his voice softened by regret. He looked at Luke, his gaze lingering for a moment. "I'm sorry, son. I should have known better than to believe the rumors." Luke's jaw tightened, but his eyes softened for a brief moment as he looked at Clara. He didn't say anything, but Clara could see the tension in his shoulders begin to ease, the weight of the past few days slowly lifting from him. The sheriff turned to Clara then, his expression shifting as he spoke directly to her. "I owe you an apology too, Miss Whitfield. We should have never believed the gossip. You've been through a lot, and it wasn't fair to judge you based on someone else's mistakes." Clara felt the sting of his words, the same sting that had come from all the town's whispers, but this time it didn't hurt as much. Instead, she felt a strange sense of relief, like a door that had been closed for so long was finally opening. "I'm not blameless either," the sheriff added, his gaze shifting to Luke. "I should have known better than to let that man's lies spread. But I've learned something through all this. Sometimes the truth takes longer to find than we expect." Clara nodded, her chest tight as she held back the emotions that threatened to spill over. She hadn't asked for this, hadn't wanted the town to turn its back on her, but in some strange way it felt good to finally hear the truth, however painful it might be. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said, her voice steady. She wasn't sure who she was thanking, the sheriff for his apology, or Henry for finally giving her the closure she needed. Perhaps it was a little of both. Luke stood silent for a moment longer, his gaze lost in the distance, but then he turned and walked over to Clara, his steps slow but purposeful. He didn't say anything at first, but the weight of his presence beside her spoke volumes. Clara looked up at him, and for the first time she saw the guilt in his eyes, not just for the things that had happened with Henry, but for everything that had come between them. "You didn't know," Clara said quietly, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. "You didn't know any of this." Luke nodded, his hand brushing lightly over hers, his voice rough with emotion. "I should have seen it, should have known something wasn't right. I let my past blind me to the truth." Clara gave a small, uncertain smile, though her heart still carried the weight of everything they had been through. "We all carry our burdens, Luke," she said softly. "But that doesn't mean we can't let them go." Luke's eyes met hers, and for a moment the world around them seemed to pause, the noise of the town fading into the distance. There was no more guilt, no more blame, just the two of them standing in the quiet aftermath of all that had happened. "You're right," he said quietly. "I'm not going to let the past hold me back any more. Not with you." Clara felt a warmth spread through her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun overhead and everything to do with the man standing beside her. The townsfolk had their own way of seeing things, but they didn't know the full story. Neither did Luke or Clara until now. The truth had finally come to light, and with it a chance for redemption. They had both been broken, but together they could rebuild. Together they could heal. The evening was settling softly over the ranch, the pale glow of the moon casting long shadows over the land. Clara stood at the edge of the porch, her hand resting lightly on the weathered railing as she gazed out at the vast expanse of the prairie. The air was cool, tinged with the scent of sagebrush and earth. The storm that had raged through their lives seemed to have passed, but there was an undeniable stillness in the air now, one that hinted at a new beginning, a quiet promise of healing. She could feel Luke's presence behind her before she heard his footsteps, the heavy, familiar rhythm that she had come to associate with him in these past weeks. She didn't turn around, not yet. There were words between them, things that needed to be said, and a weight on her heart that she couldn't quite place. "Clara," Luke's voice broke the silence, deep and warm. He was standing just behind her now, his presence a quiet reassurance. She didn't need to look at him to know how much he meant to her. But there was still something unresolved between them, something she hadn't yet allowed herself to acknowledge fully. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting his, and for a moment neither of them spoke. His gaze was intense, but tender. There was no more distance between them, no more wall. His eyes seemed to see straight through to her heart, and Clara felt a strange mixture of relief and vulnerability, as though she were standing in front of him for the first time, completely open and exposed. "Luke," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "I don't know what to do with all of this. After everything that's happened." He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and there was an urgency in his movements, as if he couldn't bear to be far from her, even for a moment. "You don't have to decide anything right now," Luke said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "But I need you to know something I should have said a long time ago." Clara's breath caught, her heart skipping in her chest. She had known this was coming, had felt the shift in him over the past few days, but hearing him say it aloud felt like a weight lifting from her chest. "I can't change what's happened between us," he continued, his voice raw. "But I can be honest with you now. I care for you, Clara, more than I ever thought I could care for anyone again." He hesitated, his eyes searching hers as though seeking the courage to say the next part. "I've kept people at a distance for so long, kept myself locked away from anyone who might hurt me. But with you, I've realized something. I don't want to keep running anymore. Clara's heart was racing now, her thoughts a blur as she absorbed his words. The fear, the guilt, the uncertainty, it all melted away in the warmth of his confession. For so long she had wondered if they could truly rebuild, if the damage done was too great to overcome. But now, standing before him, she felt a quiet peace beginning to settle inside her. "I want you here with me, Clara," Luke said, his voice low and earnest. "Not as someone who works for me, not as someone I've just taken in out of guilt, but as someone I care for deeply." The simplicity of his words, the raw honesty in them, made Clara's throat tighten with emotion. She had come to this place to escape a life that had never felt like hers, to find a fresh start in a world that felt strange and unfamiliar. But in the months since she had arrived, she had found something more than just a new beginning. She had found a home, not in the land, but in him. "Luke," she whispered, her voice shaking slightly, "I don't know if I can just let go of everything like that. My past, my fears, it's hard to trust again." Luke reached out, his hand gentle as he cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing lightly over her skin. "You don't have to trust everything right now, Clara. But trust me when I say that I'm here and I won't let you go. I want to build something with you, a future. If you'll have me." Clara's breath caught in her throat as she stared up at him, the words she had been holding inside now spilling out in a rush. "I never wanted to fall for you," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I told myself I wouldn't. I didn't want to open myself up to the pain of losing someone again. But now, I can't deny it. I care for you, Luke, more than I ever thought I could." Luke's gaze softened and a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. He stepped closer, his hand still holding hers as he pulled her gently toward him. "I'm glad," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so damn glad." And then, before either of them could say another word, Luke leaned down, his lips brushing against hers in a slow, hesitant kiss. It was tentative at first, as though neither of them could quite believe what was happening, but as Clara's arms slipped around his neck, pulling him closer, the kiss deepened, became more urgent, more desperate. It was a kiss that spoke of everything they had been through, the pain, the distance, the walls they had built around their hearts. And yet it was a kiss that promised more than that. It promised healing, it promised a future. Clara's world spun, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't want to fight it. She didn't want to resist the pull between them. The past was still there, lingering in the corners of her mind, but in this moment she let it go. The future, their future, was all that mattered. They pulled away, breathless, but neither of them moved. They stood there in the stillness, their foreheads resting together as they shared the quiet intimacy of the moment. "You don't have to leave," Luke said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Stay with me, Clara, for good, not just for a few months or until you've had enough. Stay with me. We'll build something together, something that's ours." Clara's heart swelled with the words, and though she still carried the weight of her past, she knew she wasn't carrying it alone anymore. Luke was beside her, and for the first time the world didn't feel so overwhelming. "I'm staying," she whispered, her voice steady and full of conviction. "I'm staying." And under the star-lit sky, as the winds of the prairie whispered around them, Clara and Luke knew that this was just the beginning of something new, something beautiful, something that would last. Chapter 4. A Prairie Wedding. The morning sun rose slowly over Willow Creek, casting a golden light that seemed to transform the town into something almost magical. The streets, usually quiet and dusty, were alive with purpose and excitement. The air was thick with the scent of fresh-cut flowers, baking bread, and the savory aromas of meals being prepared. Today wasn't just any day. Today was Clara and Luke's wedding day, and the entire town of Willow Creek had come together to make it something special. Clara stood at the edge of the porch, her hands resting on the railing, watching as the town bustled with activity. She couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at how the people of this small town had rallied together. The old wooden posts of the town square were decorated with colourful ribbons and flowers, and strings of lanterns hung from the trees, ready to glow in the evening light. The saloon, the general store, even the sheriff's office had been swept clean, and the people who had once whispered behind Clara's back now greeted her with smiles and nods of approval. Her heart swelled with gratitude. In the span of only a few months, she had gone from being an outsider, a woman marked by scandal, to someone embraced by this community. It wasn't just Luke who had helped her heal, it was the people here, their acceptance and their warmth. She had found a place, a home, in the most unexpected of places. Mary Lou appeared at the door behind her, carrying a basket filled with wild flowers. Her eyes sparkled with a knowing, kind smile, and Clara felt a wave of affection for the older woman who had become such a dear friend. "I've got your flowers ready," Mary Lou said, stepping forward and holding out the basket. "The town is abuzz today, Clara. You've made this place come alive with your happiness." Clara took the basket, her fingers brushing against Mary Lou's with a quiet "thank you." She could feel the energy in the air, the excitement of the day. There was a warmth to it all, a sense of hope that had been rekindled in Willow Creek since she had arrived. It wasn't just about the wedding. It was about the healing of old wounds, the coming together of people who had once been divided by fear and misunderstanding. "I never thought this day would come," Clara said softly, her voice filled with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. "It all feels like a dream." Mary Lou chuckled, her hand lightly resting on Clara's arm. "Oh, it's no dream, my dear. You've earned this happiness, and now it's time to celebrate." The town's women, led by Mary Lou, had worked tirelessly for days in preparation for the event. Every detail had been considered, from the decorations to the feast that would follow the ceremony. Clara had insisted on a simple celebration, nothing too grand or elaborate. But the townsfolk had gone above and beyond. They had transformed the dusty, worn streets into something out of a fairy tale, and Clara couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for everything they had done. As Mary Lou guided Clara into the small room at the back of the boarding house, she glanced around, her eyes taking in the delicate lace and the soft fabric of the dress laid out on the bed. It was simple but elegant, just as Clara had wanted. The dress was made from soft, cream-coloured cotton, with delicate lace trimming the neckline and sleeves. It was modest but beautiful, the kind of gown a woman could wear with pride, yet not draw undue attention. Mary Lou's fingers deftly unbuttoned Clara's dress, helping her slip into the gown. The fabric was cool against Clara's skin, and as she gazed into the mirror she felt a sense of peace settle in her chest. For the first time in a long time she could look at herself without the shadow of the past clouding her vision. She was no longer the woman who had been abandoned, the woman who had been whispered about and judged. She was a woman who had found love, who had found a place to belong. "You look beautiful, Clara," Mary Lou said, her voice filled with affection. "Luke won't know what hit him." Clara smiled, her eyes brightening as she looked at herself in the mirror. "Thank you, Mary Lou. I couldn't have done this without you." Mary Lou's smile softened. "It's my pleasure, dear. We all pitch in around here. You're part of this town now, and you always will be." The door creaked open then, and Clara's breath caught as she saw Luke standing there, his tall frame filling the doorway. His eyes swept over her, and for a moment the world seemed to stop moving. He was wearing his best shirt, the one that still had traces of the ranch work he'd done over the years, but there was something about the way he stood there, looking at her, that made Clara's heart flutter. He was every bit the man she had come to love, and now, on this day, he was hers. "Clara," Luke said, his voice a low murmur. "You look—" "I don't have the words." She smiled softly, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of excitement and quiet confidence. "I think you have plenty of words, Luke Callahan, just not the right ones." Luke stepped forward, his gaze lingering on her as if he couldn't quite believe she was standing there, ready to be his. His hand reached out, but he stopped just short of touching her. "I don't deserve this, Clara, but I'm damned sure grateful for it." Clara's smile deepened and she moved toward him, her heart brimming with emotion. "We both deserve this. We've earned it, together." Luke reached out then, his hand resting on her cheek as he gently leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers. "I'm the luckiest man alive." They stood there for a moment, lost in the quiet intimacy of the moment, before Mary Lou's voice broke through. "You two are about to miss your own wedding," she teased, her voice full of affection. "Come on now, we've got a town to celebrate with." Clara's heart leapt as she glanced at Luke, and he smiled back at her, his expression full of warmth and affection. They walked out of the room hand in hand, stepping into the bright sunlight and the bustling celebration outside. The town had gathered in the square, and as Clara and Luke walked toward the makeshift altar, the people of Willow Creek cheered, clapping and calling out their congratulations. The streets had been transformed into a festive scene. Ribbons and flowers adorned every building, and lanterns hung from trees, their light twinkling like stars in the fading afternoon. The scent of roasting meat and freshly baked bread filled the air, and the sound of music echoed through the town. Luke held Clara's hand firmly as they reached the front of the crowd, and Clara's eyes glistened with tears as she looked around at the faces of the people who had become her family. There was Mary Lou, her eyes shining with pride, and Sheriff Gaines smiling warmly in the crowd. Even the town's children were gathered around, their faces alight with excitement. Luke's voice broke through her thoughts as the ceremony began, his words soft but clear. "Clara, I promise to stand by you in good times and bad, to love you, honor you, and cherish you as long as I live." Tears spilled over as Clara's heart swelled with emotion, and she looked up at Luke, her voice barely a whisper as she repeated the vows she had never thought she would make. "I promise the same, Luke, with all that I am." As the ceremony concluded, the crowd erupted into cheers, and Clara and Luke shared their first kiss as husband and wife, the sound of clapping and laughter surrounding them. The world seemed to fall away as they held each other close, the love they shared now cemented in front of their friends, their family, and the entire town. In that moment, under the open sky, the prairie stretched out before them, filled with endless possibilities, and Clara knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she would face them with Luke by her side. Together they had found their place. Together they had found their home. The Callahan Ranch stood on the edge of the Golden Plains, the endless stretch of grass rippling like an ocean in the wind. The morning sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm amber glow over the land, as if the heavens themselves were celebrating the day. The ranch, usually quiet and humble, had been transformed for the occasion. A makeshift aisle had been lined with wild flowers and soft ribbons, leading to a wooden arch draped with lace and greenery. It was simple, yet it felt like something out of a dream, something that only happened once in a lifetime. Clara stood at the edge of the ranch house, her breath catching in her throat as she looked out at the gathering of people. The whole town had come together to witness this moment, and she could hardly believe it was happening. The very thought of standing here, of marrying Luke after everything they'd been through, still felt surreal. Luke stood just a few steps away, his back to her, as he spoke quietly with the sheriff. He was dressed in his finest shirt, his usual rugged demeanor softened by the occasion, but even from this distance Clara could see the tenderness in the way he moved, the way he was fully present in this moment. He wasn't the same man who had kept his distance when they first met. He was stronger now, not just in body but in spirit. And so was she. Mary Lou was at her side, her hands working expertly to adjust Clara's veil and make sure everything was perfect. Clara could feel the older woman's presence beside her like a motherly figure, strong, steady, and comforting. "You look radiant, Clara," Mary Lou said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "He's a lucky man," Clara smiled, her hands trembling slightly as she touched the delicate lace of her gown. She had never imagined a day like this, never imagined a life that could feel so full, so right. "And the lucky one," she whispered, more to herself than to Mary Lou. The wind caught her veil, lifting it slightly, and Clara's heart fluttered with a strange mix of excitement and nerves. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a new chapter in her life, one that would be written with Luke by her side. "Clara, are you ready?" Mary Lou asked, her voice gentle yet firm. Clara nodded, her smile soft but filled with the depth of all she had come to understand in the months since she had arrived in Willow Creek. She was ready for Luke, for this life, for all the promise the future held. As they stepped forward, Luke turned to face her. His gaze caught hers immediately, and Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest. There was something in the way he looked at her now, something that told her they had both come to understand the depths of what they had. She was no longer the woman who had walked into this town with nothing but a broken heart. She was a woman who had found love, and a man who would stand by her, come what may. Luke's eyes softened as he took a step toward her, his hands resting on his hips, his posture strong and proud. He looked handsome, though there was nothing about his appearance that mattered more than the emotion in his eyes. "You look incredible," Luke said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't have words, Clara. I don't think I ever will." Clara smiled, her heart swelling with everything she felt for him. "You don't have to say anything. I already know." The ceremony began as the wind shifted slightly, carrying the soft sounds of music from the fiddlers who had gathered by the side. Sheriff Gaines, standing at the front, began to speak, his voice calm and steady, as the crowd fell into a hushed silence. "Luke Callahan," Sheriff Gaines began, his eyes briefly meeting Luke's, "do you take Clara Whitfield as your lawfully wedded wife, to cherish and love in sickness and in health, for better or for worse, from this day forward?" Luke didn't hesitate. His voice rang clear and true. "I do." The sheriff turned to Clara, his gaze gentle. "And Clara Whitfield, do you take Luke Callahan as your lawfully wedded husband, to love and honor, to stand by him, through whatever may come, for all your days?" Clara felt the weight of the moment settle over her, the quiet reverence of it, and she knew in her heart there was no hesitation. She had been through so much to get here, so much pain, loss, and fear, but now, in this moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was Luke and the life they would build together. "I do," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but filled with certainty. The crowd seemed to exhale in unison, the weight of the ceremony now a part of the air itself. Sheriff Gaines smiled warmly, and with a gesture he presented the rings. Luke took Clara's hand in his fingers warm and steady as he slid the ring onto her finger. "Clara," he whispered, "I give you this ring as a promise of my love, of my faithfulness, and of all the years I'll spend with you." Clara's eyes misted as she took the ring from the sheriff, slipping it onto Luke's finger. "Luke," she whispered back, her heart overflowing with emotion, "I give you this ring as a promise to stand beside you, to love you, and to share every moment of my life with you, no matter what." Sheriff Gaines smiled, his voice thick with emotion, as he pronounced them husband and wife. "Then, by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss the bride." Luke didn't hesitate. He took Clara's face in his hands, his fingers trembling as he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was soft at first, but soon deepened with a passion that had been waiting for this moment. Clara melted into him, her heart racing as she kissed him back with all the love and devotion she had carried for him since the day they first met. When they pulled away, their foreheads touched, and for a moment the world seemed to disappear. The cheers from the crowd faded into the background, and it was just the two of them, standing in the golden light of the prairie, ready to face the future together. The air was filled with the sound of applause, the townsfolk cheering for them as they walked hand in hand toward the celebration that awaited them. Clara's heart fluttered with happiness, knowing that this was the beginning of something beautiful, something lasting. As they walked through the streets of Willow Creek, the town seemed to celebrate with them. The air was filled with music, laughter, and the sweet scent of cake and flowers. Clara and Luke had found their place, not just in each other's arms, but in the heart of a town that had come together to celebrate them. And as they looked out at the endless horizon, the future ahead of them seemed brighter than ever. The evening light was soft and golden as Clara and Luke rode side by side, their horses moving at a leisurely pace as they made their way up the ridge. The air was cool and crisp, a refreshing breeze sweeping across the plains, rustling the grass and the wild flowers that dotted the landscape. It was the perfect end to a perfect day. Clear skies above them, a gentle wind at their backs, and the sound of the prairie all around them. Luke's hand rested on the reins, but every now and then his fingers would brush against Clara's. She could feel the warmth of his touch, the reassurance that they were in this together, that this moment, this life they were beginning was just the start of something new, something full of possibility. As they reached the top of the ridge, Clara's breath caught in her throat. The view before them was breathtaking. Willow Creek stretched below, its small buildings and dusty streets now hidden beneath the glow of twilight. Beyond the town, the prairie spread out like an endless sea of golden grasses, the horizon a blur of light and colour. Where the sky met the earth, it was vast, unbroken, and beautiful, just like the future they were about to step into together. Clara felt the weight of the moment settle in her chest. This wasn't just the end of the ceremony, the vows, the celebration. It was the beginning of something much deeper, a life she had never expected to find. Luke pulled his horse to a stop, dismounting gracefully before offering his hand to Clara. She took it, feeling the strength in his grip as he helped her to the ground. They stood there for a moment, side by side, looking out over the land. The sun was dipping lower now, casting long shadows across the prairie, painting the world in hues of lavender, pink, and gold. "You know," Luke said softly, his voice low but filled with content, "I never thought I'd see the day when I'd be standing here like this, with you by my side." Clara turned to him, her heart swelling with affection. "I never thought I'd be standing here either. I came to this town looking for a husband, but I found so much more." She paused, her voice thick with emotion as she gazed up at him. "I found a home, a place where I belong, and a love stronger than the prairie winds." Luke smiled, the warmth in his expression reaching deep into Clara's soul. He cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing over her cheek, as if memorizing the feel of her skin beneath his touch. "You're my home, Clara. You always have been. I didn't know it then, but I know it now. This is where I belong, right here, with you." For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need. The quiet of the prairie, the vastness of the land stretching before them, spoke louder than words ever could. Clara closed her eyes, her heart full as she leaned into Luke's touch. She thought of everything they had been through, of the pain, the doubts, the moments of fear. But now, standing here on the edge of their future, it all felt so distant. All that mattered was the life they were about to build, the love they had found in each other. "I love you, Luke," Clara whispered, her voice soft but sure. "I love you too, Clara," Luke replied, his voice filled with quiet certainty. "More than I thought I could ever love anyone." The wind stirred again, lifting the hair from Clara's face as she looked out over the prairie, the sky now painted in a deepening shade of violet. She felt something shift inside her, as though the very air was filled with the promise of tomorrow, of all the days that lay ahead. Together they stood at the edge of it all, their future wide open before them. The prairie, vast and untamed, seemed to stretch on forever, and Clara knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it side by side. Luke's hand found hers again, his fingers intertwining with hers as they stood there, the quiet hum of the prairie surrounding them like a lullaby. In the distance, the stars began to twinkle, one by one, filling the sky with their soft glow. Clara smiled, her heart lighter than it had ever been. She had come to Willow Creek looking for a husband, but in the end she had found so much more than that. She had found love and home. And as they rode back toward the town, their laughter mingling with the soft rustling of the prairie, Clara knew that this was just the beginning of their story. A story that would be written in the wind, in the stars, and in the hearts of the two of them forever.